We'll begin our discussion of Genesis with a little bit of context. And first, I want to say that Genesis is a very, very old story, but it's not the oldest creation story that we have. And so, as different regions and different peoples were putting together stories, particularly in this region that we'll call the Fertile Crescent, the Hebrews were one, or the Semites, I guess, who actually gave rise to the story, were one group in a long list of competing groups or tribes for dominance in this region. And so it's likely that even though we have some overlap between some of these cultures in the stories they tell and the way they tell stories, it's likely that this particular story won out because the people, the tribe, this Hebrew tribe, ultimately became victorious in this region. And so kind of keep that in mind as we go through. It doesn't certainly delegitimize the story in any way to understand that it is one of many stories. And because these people tended to spread out as many of these nomadic people did and conquer new territories, as they conquered new people, they would begin to absorb their culture, their stories, and within their own mythology make it their own. And so we'll see some interesting things as we kind of pull through and take a look at this. And so we're going to start with Genesis chapter 1. We'll be going through really 4 chapters of Genesis. The first 2 will take us probably the largest amount of time to look at. And in some ways, the first 2 are probably the most interesting because they seem to be 2 very different stories of creation. But let's focus first on chapter 1, which generally begins with the famous "in the beginning." God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so what I want to kind of get to there is you have a notion of God as this great architect, this being who sits in this vast primordial emptiness of space and meticulously begins to craft things in a very logical and ordered way. But I also want to kind of make reference to the things that he's creating, because some of the tribes that these people were bumping up against, like the Egyptians and others, they too had gods that they worshiped that figured into their creation stories. And so it's relevant, I think, to consider that when God begins to speak into creation and he begins to evaluate his creation, he separates things from being a chaotic world into being a very ordered and logical and systematic world. And what we get is that he is clearly, by creating the sun, he's establishing, or the story is establishing, the primacy of this God we'll know as Elohim or Yahweh or God, who has primacy over the Egyptian god Ra, who is the god of the sun. And so to create the sun and the moon, the principal gods of some of these competing religions, these competing cultures, is to put them in their place and to identify your God as being supreme. Okay? We have God as an architect here. We have God creating out of the image, sculpting the earth, as it were, and pulling together. So it is good. It is both beautiful, it is good, and it has a defined purpose. Every bit of creation has a defined purpose for him. Okay? And so as we look at this again, just a reminder, the animals, the stars, the sun, the moon, many of these were principal gods, part of the creation scheme for these other competing cultures. And so it's not a wonder that the God that makes this is one that ultimately has to establish dominance, okay? And we'll see later when the serpent enters the garden why it takes the form of a snake and how that feeds some of this mythology as well. Okay, so moving forward a little more with the story, as these animals and things are created, you'll notice they are created in what's known as a peaceable garden, okay? It is a world where animals get along and everything is a vegetarian, okay? So we don't have we don't have death. It's not entered into the kingdom. And so you can see by this great work of art, you see all the animals living in harmony with one another. There's no sense of dominance. There's no sense of anger. There's no prey. There's no predator. And I don't know if you can make out the figure of the humans way back in the middle of that garden, but they're kind of part of the scenery. They get along with things. But it's important that in the creation of man, man is that pinnacle. And so one of the things that's important for us to kind of make note of is the order that we have, this domain that's been created here. And let me pull this up a little bigger because it's worth kind of looking at. All right? So what we have here is a kind of a pyramid shape of the hierarchical structure. So we learn Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and this establishes, the Hebrew people establishes very logical, systematic way of looking at creation. At the top is the divinity, okay, the divine, okay, and then you'll notice that at the pinnacle of the creation, the very last thing, the thing that he spends the most time on is mankind, particularly Adam, as we get to chapter 2. Although it should be noted in chapter 1, Adam and Eve, although they're not given names, male and female, are created almost simultaneously, okay? And so that man is given dominance over the living animals, including dominance. He is chosen above the angels, okay, to be made in the image of God. All right. So if we look at that hierarchical structure, the placement of man at that pinnacle is something that we'll see again when we look at the Quran and their version. And this is what causes the trouble in heaven. This is what causes a split with Lucifer or Satan, who becomes angry that God is making angels bow down before man. Okay. And so as we look at this, we have a split in our duties. So the angels are in charge of everything heavenly, okay? But mankind is in charge of everything earthly, which includes the animals, the garden. He's meant to tend the garden. He is the ultimate, gardener, all right? And then you'll see that is lost by mankind when the garden is lost, okay? And so man, even though he is still given dominion over these things, it's kind of secondary because something's occurred, okay? Humanity was intended from the beginning, even before creation, to be in charge of things, okay? To take his rightful place there, okay? So that last creation of humankind is the pinnacle, it's the peak. They are made in God's image. The only thing that separates man from God is the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? And so man, in order to keep him, not to be equal with God, but in order to keep him in that secondary role, he must not be given, or he is told not to gain access to the knowledge of good and evil, and he is also forbidden the tree of life, okay? So that when he eats the apple, he gains the knowledge of good and evil. He gains that wisdom. But what he is abandoning as he is kicked out of the Garden of Eden, as he is punished, is he must now be punished with death. That is the result of his sin, okay? And whether or not you believe in this concept of sin or original sin, the sin is not necessarily carried on. The sin is that mankind knows death, all right, which before this point has not entered into the garden. So it's evident that when they are not forbidden to eat from the tree of life, so prior to that, they must have the ability to eat from that tree. They must be in this perpetual state of childhood. Okay. All right. So as we move a little further, let's take a look. I have some images here that are kind of interesting, worth looking at. So this is from the Sistine Chapel. Another great depiction of God in his creation, that grandfatherly God that we have, surrounded by his angelic host, reaching out to Adam to give him that spark of life. An amazing kind of iconic image there. We also have from William Blake who we learned a little bit about as we did kind of that Rime of the Ancient Mariner, this image of God molding man from the earth, which is much closer to what we see in chapter 2 than it is in chapter 1. Okay, he's literally pulling the earth and forming him, but you see it's a very close relationship that God has with man in this picture. Okay, all right, and then we have one more image that I want to kind of take a look at, because this is part of the mythology. Much of what we look at as the story of Adam and Eve comes to us not from Genesis. Genesis is very scant. What a lot of it comes from is from a work known as Paradise Lost, which was an amazing compilation by John Milton. A retelling of the fall of mankind is contained in that story, where we get the title Paradise Lost. And in that version, we get much of the mythology, the idea that the serpent is Satan. That's never mentioned in Genesis. The idea that the fruit that they eat is an apple. And what I like about this is you see this young couple and you see them with this fruit. It's very indiscriminate and indistinct. It's not an apple. It could be a fig. It could be who knows what. As a matter of fact, apples were not indigenous to this region, so it's unlikely that the apple would have been the fruit. But I like the apple as a choice, and we'll talk about that in class when we watch the film. So you can visit your own various depictions of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Just do a Google search or go through Google Art Project, and you'll see some of those pictures kind of pop up. Okay, so that's our beginning point, our beginning lecture for this intro into Genesis.